I'll just leave it there. Yes, Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Can I go back to something we asked about before lunch? In particular, the CCTV of the van.
Yes.
Which van was it where the CCTV should have been working but wasn't?
I have no idea. I was informed there was a van with CCTV at the locus.
Right. We've heard about a custody van, as it was called, a transit van, driven by the first two officers at the scene. Was that more likely to be the van that was being discussed?
I think there was only one van with CCTV potential at the scene.
Right. We've heard about a fish van. It was called a fish van, but it was a much smaller van.
No, it's not that.
It wouldn't be that.
No.
So much more likely to be the custody van. And after you discovered that there was a problem with the CCTV, it wasn't playing, and you've told us that it hadn't been working for a while, did you carry out any further investigations into gathering in an explanation as to why that hadn't been working?
No, I did not. And I would have expected the divisional area to pick that up. Chief Superintendent Gary McEwen was a commander and was involved in the incident, so I would imagine he would have picked that up, but certainly not for myself.
Right. So why would Gary McEwen pick that up if you'd obviously wanted to identify CCTV for the purposes of your investigation?
Yes.
And narrowing down the hypotheses? Why would Gary McEwen be the one to pick that up?
So the information came back from the technical support unit representative that came out to examine the van and the CCTV that it was inoperational, and it looked as if it hadn't been recording for some time was the information that came back to myself around that. And it was, I think it was discussed at one of the goal groups as well around that aspect of it. As SIO, it's nothing I would actually have got involved in round about maintenance and repair and of CCTV. I would have left that to a divisional rep within that particular area. So Gary McEwen is a divisional commander of that particular area. So I would imagine Gary or the area commander, who was Nicky Shepherd at the time, would have picked up on the aspect that it wasn't working. The fact that we had the TSU called out, they would have detailed a fault with the system anyway, and it would be thereafter it went through the whole process of being repaired, I would imagine, just the fact that they've come out and identified it as not functional.
Right, so was it effectively, as soon as you discovered there wasn't any evidential value from the purpose of your investigation, your interest came to an end? And thereafter, any ongoing interest would be seen as maintenance and repair? A
local matter, I would suggest it would be, yeah.
Right. Did you consider whether there was a reason behind the fact it hadn't been playing or working on that day?
No, however the information came back was it hadn't been working for some time. It wasn't just that particular day it hadn't been recording, but the information that came back, I think through Colin or through one of the other persons involved in the investigation, was it hadn't been working for some time, so it wasn't just that day it hadn't recorded. I'm not sure exactly the extent of how far it went back, but the information was it wasn't just that day, that the information that I received.
And did that information then lead you to think there was no nefarious reason behind that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Did you consider who commonly drove that custody van?
No.
And whether the first two officers at the scene, we've heard evidence, I think last year in the first hearing, that they often drove that particular van. Did you carry out any investigations in relation to why the situation had continued for some time?
No. As I said in the introductory remarks, I was there as an on-call senior investigating officer dealing with the critical nature of the investigation. Areas such as that would have undoubtedly been picked up, I would imagine, through the course of the inquiry, but for myself, dealing with that critical aspect of the first days or first day of it is something that wasn't a priority for me, to be honest.
Right.
And the other aspect is I wasn't aware who regularly drove that van, and I had no knowledge at all of the officers involved in the incident. I'd never met any of the officers before that were involved, actually, as the principal officers involved in it.
We've heard that you were brought in from Lothian and Borders because you weren't, you were independent,
Yes.
if you like, of the response team and those involved.
Yes.
Just before lunch, we were talking about Colette Bell.
Yes.
I'd like to go back to that. And you talked about you were not aware of the situation with Colette Bell until between around 10 and 10:30 when you had your briefing.
That's correct.
From Colin Robson. And we looked at your day book, PS 18269, and you have talked us through some of the entries within your day book
Mm-hmm.
which related to information from the call cards.
Yes.
And just before lunch, you said you weren't really sure how relevant Colette Bell was at that particular time when you first became involved. I think you'd been advised, or you were aware, that there was a potential link between the reason she'd made a call to the police and the events in Hayfield Road.
I would say it was more than a potential, it was a significant link. I think I highlighted that. I mean, to me that call was really significant, and it did appear to link into the timescales and what she was reporting. So again, it wasn't just a potential line, it was a really significant line of inquiry.
And I think you did say before lunch that she would be a significant witness or a significant person for you to speak to as part of your inquiry. And as well as noting the entries in the call card which you've gone through, I think on the next page of your day book you do note down matters in relation to Colette Bell in particular.
Yeah.
So you've noted down Bell and entries from the call cards on the first page 4, but the following page there's entries next to Colette Bell.
Yes.
Can you explain when you prepared these notes? We'll wait till they're on the screen. Thank you, that's them.
So that must have been between 10 and 11 o'clock. It looks as if it's been whilst Colette Bell has been within the office being interviewed. I've got noted down at 10:20 hours the call from Keith Harrow at the PERK, which I detailed at the time of the call.
Is that the first sort of entry?
Yeah.
Well, what do the under the redacted passages? What does that actually say? It starts.
So interview advisor. So again, I'm just kind of noting in my mind that I'm looking for an interview advisor as well potentially. So, as I say,
would
it's
that
just,
be in relation to Colette Bell in particular?
no,
or
just in general, just for the
in general?
investigation. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. It was just something I hadn't picked up earlier on in my priorities. So.
Right. So this is another priority that you're thinking about. And would that be in relation to interviewing witnesses?
In general, yeah, yeah.
And what sort of role do they take?
They produce an interview plan for the interviewing officers. They will collate the relevant statements prior to that and produce an interview plan. They'll thereafter brief who's going to interview the particular individual and develop a strategy around triggers, pointers in respect to that, areas to be covered. So again, quite a significant role as well.
Mm-hmm. And then underneath that, you said you've noted a call at 10:20 with Keith Harrower from PERK.
Yeah.
And what was that in relation to?
So that was the first call from Keith, identifying himself as the PERK lead officer at that time. So again, we had a discussion at that stage that Keith was trying to identify resources from PERK. They may be a considerable time. But his intention was to attend at Kirkcaldy Police Office to obviously lead on the investigation at the direction of Crown, and that he would, I think we spoke about, I gave him a brief where we were with some of the early stages of the investigation, just round about some of the priority actions that I'd identified. So again back into the previous pages of the book, round about the priorities, round about the various scenes that we'd identified at that time. And we can agree that these would be the areas of focus at this stage, and Keith indicated he'd give me a call later on that morning once he began to make his way towards Kirkcaldy.
Did you have concerns about, you've mentioned PERK resources. Can you explain what impact those had on their ability to come to Kirkcaldy and take the lead?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I believe it was probably the most significant deployment of PERK at that particular stage. They came online obviously just 2013, just after Police Scotland. And as I said before, I had previous dealings with them, mainly remotely, around death following police contact. But I think it was the mechanics about how the PERK / Police Scotland investigation would thereafter materialise and what that would involve. So again, I think it was the capacity of PERK at that particular time to respond to such a significant incident caused me a little concern at that point, not knowing exactly when they would arrive and what sort of resources they would attend with. I spoke to Keith about that kind of strategy moving forward, and Keith had indicated when about such as joint deployments of some of the more crucial witnesses or areas of note, such as joint crime scene manager deployment to Arn Crescent, to Hayfield Road. So again, because it was so fast moving, it was really, really difficult to hold this back, because it was, as I say, we had Colette, we knew we had to trace Said. Martin Dick was becoming relevant at that particular stage as well, and because of the fast-moving nature of it, it was really, really difficult to basically to hold it back or stop doing what you were doing at that particular time. And to Keith's credit, he agreed with that, the fact that we would just simply progress the activities and the actions that we were progressing at that particular time. And I was saying to Keith I'd keep him fully updated where we were with it. But it did give me a bit of concern when about how practically that would work once PERK arrived, in respect of ownership and direction, and the ability to have the capability and the capacity to respond to what we were actually dealing with.
You talk about having difficulty holding back. In relation, you've talked about 10:20 there, you've noted the first contact with PERK, with Keith Harrower over the phone. Where was this sense of being held back coming from? Was it the police feeling they should hold back because PERK were going to take the lead? Or was that coming from PERK wanting the police to hold back?
I mean, I think the areas that I had identified as priority, I ran by Keith and said, look, my suggestion just now, you are lead investigator. This is sitting solely with the PERK with support from Police Scotland. However, we have, such as Colette Bell is essential, we need to trace Said, it's critical that we speak to him. We're aware that the deceased had attended Martin Dick's house to watch the boxing, so again Martin Dick was coming. So there were areas that I'd spoke to Keith about the relevance aspect of it and how crucial it was. There were other areas we spoke about, house to house, and about the priority area of the scene at Hayfield Road. Again, which we were quite happy to stand back from, secure as it was at that stage, and we would thereafter look at the kind of joint deployment at that stage of a crime scene manager from PERK, as well as support from Police Scotland when about production officers as such. So again, I think they were putting on hold. I mean, I don't think it was the case that we were putting anything on hold. I think it was just that I was giving Keith an understanding. The fact is that it would have impacted on the potential success of the investigation if we basically had such as, okay, Colette, you're at the office but we can't speak to you just now because we're waiting in PERK, or detectives don't go to speak to or try to trace Said because we're waiting in PERK attending. So that call is at 10:20 hours. We don't have the PERK arriving to 13:35 hours. By that time of the arrival of PERK, a great deal of the statements and the identification of the priorities have either been progressed to an extent where we know exactly what, or we potentially know or have an understanding of what's occurred. So again, it's really difficult because traditionally as an SIO, I would fast track a lot of these actions around it. And I did do so that day as well, but again, through consultation with Keith, that, look, I know you're coming through to lead on it, but this is my suggestion that we still progress some of these aspects of the investigation.
It sounds like although PERK were lead investigators, that the direction, the strategy, the actual tasks were all being done by Police Scotland at that stage in the morning.
Yes, they were, but it was through consultation with Keith, who agreed that they would be the priority action. So it was difficult for Keith to lead on an investigation that he's actually not within that particular territorial area, or he's not aware of some of the competing challenges we're facing. So as I say, through communication, and there was a number of calls with Keith through the course of the day before he arrived, and it was around making sure that he was aware and he endorsed, as the lead investigator and the lead agency being PERK, what we were actually progressing and taking on.
And thinking to your evidence earlier about the gold-silver command structure, you talked about the investigation being part of the bronze investigator column of work holding up this structure. Were PERK effectively coming in to take over that element?
Yeah, so they
not the whole thing?
No. The bronze investigation aspect of it, at 9:35, when Craig Blackhall makes me aware that PERK are going to lead on it, they've been appointed by Crown, I knew eventually that once the arrival of PERK and there was an effective handover, that bronze investigative strand would sit solely with PERK with the support of Police Scotland.
But all the other work that was Nicholson as Gold Command was in charge of, and the Silver Command, Gary McEwen, and the other bronze members of that structure, they were still under the charge of Police Scotland.
Yes.
So PERK's only role was in relation to the investigation side.
That's correct, and I believe they thereafter got terms of reference from Crown Office. I think it was the following day, round about exactly what they would take on as part of the investigation and what Police Scotland would manage as such. So I think that came the day after in respect to that.
And in terms of your ongoing role, you were SIO, appointed by a senior member of the police.
Yeah.
How did your relationship with PERK develop after they did arrive at Kirkcaldy? I mean, you've talked about them having a handover and being in charge, but you've also told us today that you continued to be involved for a while.
And I did, and it was difficult to stand back from the investigation when it was moving at such pace and we were progressing so much activity and actions around it. And as I say, PERK arrived around about 13:35 on the 3rd of May. At that time, there was a limited number of PERK resources that were available at that stage. I did go into a briefing with Keith and some of the team that arrived from PERK, as well as some of my resources. And we explained to them where we were and some of the priority areas that we were focusing on, and what information, evidence, intelligence we had at that particular stage. And these were thereafter the priorities around that. So that was almost an investigative briefing stroke handover to the PERK in respect of where we were at that time. That was prior to the 1440 goal group. However, I did continue to basically maintain some sort of ownership in tandem with Keith Harrower around the inquiry through the course of that day, because, as I say, it was so fast moving, and we had significant resources from Police Scotland involved in it at that particular stage.
How effective do you think that handover process was? Because we've heard evidence about PERK come in and they take over, they're the lead investigators. And there could be some suggestion that appears that they slot in seamlessly and Police Scotland step back. What was the reality actually like on the day?
So I think there's 2 points to that. I think the structure and the response by PERK today is, as you describe, about that almost seamless transition that PERK came in would take on the investigation. The challenges we had in 2015 was that there was no tried and trusted model round about how this relationship would merge and work, and was it seamless? No, it wasn't. I mean, there was challenges with it. But we are in a far better place now in respect to that, because of collaborative working, because of testing, because of immersive training and so on and so forth. But at that time, it was difficult because we had PERK resources, and again, round about the extent of even areas such as forensic awareness and capability of their crime scene managers. I mean, was that up to date? Was that as accurate as resources we had from Police Scotland round about, such as forensic opportunities that existed at that particular time? I knew a lot of the PERK resources that turned up because they were ex-police officers, mainly from kind of the Strathclyde area. So again, I know they had left the police for a number of years. So again, I had slight concerns around about their awareness, their capability, and also the capacity around about the number of resources that turned up at that time to take on an investigation such as this, which was gathering pace. There was significant media attention around it, so it wasn't just the investigative side. There was other areas that were playing out at that time.
When you say you had concerns at their capacity, what do you mean by that?
Resources-wise, I mean, I think we had about, I recall at one time we had probably about 22 resources on at one time from Police Scotland, detective officers involved in investigation. I think at that day, I think they turned up with 4 or 5 PERK. So it was clear that PERK on their arrival had to prioritise what they thought were the significant scenes around that. So again, that was developed through the course of the afternoon of the 3rd roundabout. They would prioritise the Hayfield Road scene and some other areas that we were examining with Police Scotland, looking at. I think the decision at that stage was Keith and PERK to look at Hayfield Road and the deceased's remains as a scene, and for the other remaining scenes to sit with Police Scotland to progress under the instruction of PERK, but for our resources to basically manage them as such.
So Police Scotland continued to manage those areas,
yes,
those scenes. And can I ask you if you have any comments about, you've mentioned the PERK officers who arrived were formerly, you knew some of them from Strathclyde,
yes,
at that time, and they'd left the police service years prior to their work in May 2015. Were you aware of any differential in terms of the rank? You know, when they'd left the police, what rank they were at? You were a detective superintendent at that stage, so a senior officer, and you had a number of inspectors working beneath you, and sergeants and constables. And you've talked about the numbers you had. Above you, you also had chief superintendents, you had an ACC in charge of the Gold Group.
Yeah.
You've talked about the numbers of PERK personnel, but what about their experience in the police force, the ranks that they had reached before they left? Did you have any sense of their prior experience of police investigations?
Yeah, 1 or 2 of them I did. 1 or 2 they worked under me in various parts of the country, so I was aware of their capabilities.
Do you remember what their names were?
Yeah, so John Ferguson. So John, unfortunately, he's passed away now. But John was one of the crime scene managers when I was DCI. He was a detective sergeant. He was one of the crime scene managers at in Lanarkshire when I was a DCI in Lanarkshire. So I knew John pretty well.
And he'd been a sergeant.
He'd been a detective sergeant.
Sergeant.
Yeah. So, as I say, I knew a number of them, but I wasn't really aware of their full background, and they knew me as well. But again, I think
Did any of them have your rank, for example?
No.
So no detective superintendents?
No.
What rank do you from memory now, had they been inspectors?
A few of them were inspectors or DIs, and I think Keith was a DCI. I might be mistaken, but I think Keith was a DCI.
Keith Harrower?
Yes.
We'll no doubt hear more evidence about
yeah.
this in the future. So did that cause you any concern about the level of experience that these former police officers had?
So the level of rank structure with PERK or the previous ranks they were in didn't really cause me any concern. It was more about how effective they could be in an environment such as we were faced with the fact is that this was, and I might be wrong, I think this was their first critical deployment en masse as PERK responding to a critical incident. Again, I might be mistaken with that, but that's my knowledge of it.
We have heard this might have been their first involvement of a death in these situations.
So it was, as well as the circumstances and the nature of the death being extremely significant and challenging, and the fact is that it was very, very unusual what had occurred. I had the added, I would say it was a challenge of PERK being deployed probably in the first instance to a critical incident, and how that relationship would bed in and how we would manage that. And again, I think I've noted, I don't know if I've noted in a statement, but there was a reluctance perhaps on my part to relinquish control of the incident due to the fact that I was conscious that it was moving at pace and I believed in the right direction at that stage. So, as I say, I had a bit of trepidation around about would it set it back, the investigation, if we'd done a complete handover at that particular time. And again, that was the kind of reluctance I was thinking and feeling around it.
So you were reluctant to hand over because of concerns that you had about where things might go?
I think it was just the fact that, I mean, what could the PERK actually do and take on with the numbers that they had when we had so many different priorities, as I've detailed in my daybook, all ongoing at that particular day. And that's even before we come to the status of officers and operational statements. So again, if you look at some of the early priorities, that had to be managed, and we had to deal with that at that particular time. We had 5 potential scenes which required a crime scene coordinator, a crime scene manager at every scene, production officers at every scene. So again, the resources were so significant, and because of the relevance to it, because of the aspect that these were, a number of these places or scenes were the dwelling houses of basically witnesses. It was crucial we done what we had to do and handed them back to the families and to the owners of the properties. So again, there was things we couldn't delay and we couldn't basically hold back on. We had to progress. So I did do a lot of that, but I did do it through consultation with Keith to say, look, I know you're not here yet, but this is my next thought, or this is where I'm going with this, or what's your thought when about status of officers, for example? Not, I mean, I see them as witnesses, what do you see them as? I should probably come on to this, but as I say, it was being managed from 9:30 remotely by PERK, by Keith being the DSI, Deputy Senior Investigator for PERK, on call and being allocated the role to lead on it. In reality, the incident's been ran by myself at Kirkcaldy with the support of Police Scotland, but I'm keeping Keith up to date with where we are with it, and there was that early lines of communication as expected with it, and as I say, there was no way there was any friction or any animosity with that. That was, I mean, it was completely fluid.
I was going to ask you if that reality had caused any tension or concern.
No, not at all.
You mentioned earlier the terms of reference in relation to PERK, and as I understand it, is that essentially the part of the instruction from Crown Office to PERK?
That's correct.
What clarity did you have about PERK's terms of reference?
So my understanding, I don't think the terms of reference came through until the next day. So in general, my understanding is that from Keith was that they had been asked to look at the aspect of the incident at Hayfield Road involving the restraint of Mr. Bio, the subsequent aftermath of that, with the earlier part of the timeline as described earlier, around about Aaron Crescent, the involvement of Saeed, Martin Dick, Kirsty, his partner, and also the motorists prior to the confrontation with the police officers at that time. That would sit with Police Scotland. So that was the kind of early terms of reference that Keith described to me, that they would deal with particular aspects of it. So, for example, we went into detail around about the house-to-house parameters and strategy, for example, once we began to look at the priorities around that, because the Hayfield Road site was a high priority to do that. And we know from experience, I mean, you really need to get detectives out there on the ground, chapping doors, looking for any eyewitnesses to this. So again, the decision would be that, and myself and Keith discussed this, is that we would simply put Police Scotland door-to-door, house-to-house officers in Hayfield Road. But if any significant witness who was an eyewitness we came across, that we would simply make PERK aware, and PERK would thereafter deploy staff and interview that particular person.
Okay, so it was clear to you at the beginning that PERK were to focus on Hayfield Road,
yes,
and the events there. But even in relation to that aspect, the house-to-house in that area had to be conducted by Police Scotland officers.
That's correct.
But on the understanding that if you did come across any witnesses, they would be PERK would be alerted and they would handle that from there.
That's correct.
In relation to the earlier matters, so you're talking about, we've heard evidence about the calls to the police and Mr. Bio being seen with a knife coming towards Hayfield Road. Who was in charge of that aspect?
So that was ourselves, that was Police Scotland.
So that was still Police Scotland?
Yeah, so we had, they were priority actions that I had generated, as I showed you in my daybook, when about TST takes statement from
Harry Kohlberg.
Yeah, so they were all high priority actions round about, let's get detectives out there just now, and basically.
PERK didn't have any involvement with that?
No, the subsequent involvement is obviously they would go back and re-interview if they deemed it to be appropriate over the coming days or weeks.
So, but on the 3rd of May,
yeah, that was Police Scotland.
That was all Police Scotland. Aaron Crescent, Colette Bell's address, was that Police Scotland?
That was Police Scotland, yes.
So even though there was an apparent connection that appeared to you to be made between Hayfield Road and Aaron Crescent, PERK weren't involved with that aspect of it?
So I'm not actually, Aaron Crescent, I'm sure that there was some sort of oversight with PERK on that one, but there were selected areas that they were looking at. Now, obviously, there was a real relevance with. I'm just trying to think. I'm sure it was Police Scotland that we put crime scene managers and resources into that, but it may have been a joint deployment. But I need to check on that, to be honest with you. But it certainly wasn't PERK on its own. If it was anything at all, it was a joint deployment.
And then you mentioned earlier the name Martin Dick. We've heard evidence from Mr. Dick. Was that a PERK matter, or was that Police Scotland?
Police Scotland.
And anything else that was Police Scotland? What about the family address of Saeed and tracing Mr. Saeed?
Police Scotland.
Police Scotland as well. And Colette Bell's house, Police Scotland. The journey to Hayfield Road, Police Scotland. Martin Dick's house, Police Scotland. Saeed's family home, Police Scotland.
Yes.
So was PERK largely in charge of the events at Hayfield Road and then the hospital? I mean, I think it's unfair to say that they were only in charge of that. They were in charge of the full investigation. I mean, they had that strategic oversight of everything. The resources around the areas of detail that Police Scotland were involved in was because we had the capacity to basically manage these different areas where PERK didn't at that time. Right. Can you explain the concept of, I know that they were the lead investigators and you've now said they were in charge, or they had oversight. In what way did they have charge over you and the actions that you were taking?
So that was down to communication. So the lead for PERK, as I say, was DSI Keith Harrower, and obviously I was the lead for Police Scotland for the investigative strand. And it was about that one-to-one communication between myself and Keith around about, Keith, this is what I'm thinking, what are you thinking, this is where the priorities lie, how are we going to resource this, are you happy for us to progress this aspect, or do you want PERK involved in this? So there was that communication through the course of the day around about how we would look at managing the priority areas that we had at that particular stage between police and PERK, with the knowledge, and it was always in my mind that there was no doubt that PERK were the lead investigating agency around this, and that was clear at 9:35 in the morning. I think the point I'm trying to make was that to enable them to meet the demands of the requirements of that day, they require significant resources from Police Scotland to assist them with that.
And as part of that, were you satisfied that you could provide those resources and that those resources would be available to PERK?
Yes.
And were you satisfied that those resources would be independent?
From Police Scotland?
From the situation that had arisen in relation to Hayfield Road, which involved Police Scotland officers from Fife Police, or Police Scotland as they were, but from the Kirkcaldy area.
Yeah. So I brought in a number of officers from out with the Fife area, as well as major investigation team officers came in as well to support the investigation. There were one or two from Fife still involved in it, and that was due to the fact that some of the significant actions were already moving, and the officers had been involved in it, and I deemed it to be I didn't deem it to be competent to remove them from it when they had built up the relationship, or they had began to, such as the two were dealing with Colette Bell, were Fife officers. So again, a lot of this was already in progress, so to stop it and bring other officers who, a lot of them hadn't arrived at that time in the morning, they were all kind of making their way to Kirkcaldy to get briefed around it.
We've heard that a number of officers travelled to Kirkcaldy office. Yeah. They weren't necessarily Kirkcaldy officers, they may have been from Fife, other areas or other offices in the Fife. Did you have a concern that any officers even from the region of Fife was too close a connection?
So myself and Leslie Bowl discussed that quite early on around, if possible, to utilise officers from out with the divisional area. And again, that was really just to protect them, as well as to ensure transparency and integrity with the investigation as it was progressing. So again, we got officers from the surrounding divisional areas as well as a major investigation team, but because of the number of priorities that were sitting there, we had to utilise some Fife resources who were from out with the Kirkcaldy area. But in general, the strategy was to utilise officers from out with P Division, the Fife area.
Right. And where were the major investigation team from?
They're from all over Scotland. They're based in, so they've got a number of different hubs across the country, and it was just who was on duty at that particular time, but they respond nationally to any demand.
We may have, in the future, we may be hearing from Keith Hardy, who, as I understand it, is from the major investigation team.
He was.
He was. And is he one of the people who came into...
Yeah, Keith came in the end of day one, and the intention on the instruction of the ACC was that Keith would, this was moving kind of late afternoon, early evening of the first day into a PERK-led investigation supported by the major investigation team of Police Scotland, and it was thereafter also moving on to a Holmes platform, which would manage the incident as it began to develop.
Right. Thank you. I'd like to go back to the situation with Colette Bell.
Yes.
And we were just about to look at your daybook entries in relation to Colette Bell. So I wondered if we could do that. I think we're on page 5. And we can see under the reference to the call with Keith Harrower from PERK, you've got the name Colette Bell written.
Yes.
I wonder if you can tell us what you have here.
Yeah, so I think this information came to me while she's been at the office, and I've been briefed in respect of it. I think it probably have came from Colin Robson. So Colette Bell interviewed IV, which is interviewed, has child to him, last spoke to him at 11:40 hours last night, and said someone had disrespected him. And I've thereafter put an arrow the afternoon of the 2nd of May, and appeared under influence, watching boxing at Martin Dick's home address with Zaid Zaid, and mobile numbers have been provided for both.
So on this page you have the names Martin Dick and Zaid Zahid mentioned. And what actions or steps did you take once you had that information?
So the actions from that was obviously to trace Martin Dick, and also Mr. Zaid as well. And
do you remember that briefing with Colin Robson?
Vaguely, yeah. It looks as if it came directly after the briefing to Keith, just with the, as I say, I've noted a lot of this at the particular time around it. So it's... so
is that sort of mid-morning, or...?
I think it was before 11 o'clock. So it's whilst Colette's at the office.
So she's still in Kirkcaldy Police Office at the time. She's being interviewed at that time, and you're getting an update from Colin Robson.
Yes.
Were you aware at that time that Colette Bell had her baby with her?
No.
Had you been made aware that she was breastfeeding?
No.
Do you know that whether she had her... Were you made aware that she had her mum with her?
No, I wasn't.
Were you aware by this stage that a death message had been passed her just shortly prior to the statement starting?
No, I wasn't.
Had you been involved in any way with the decision to deliver that death message to Colette
No,
Bell?
I wasn't.
Is that the sort of information you would have wanted to know?
Yeah. So there are aspects of any investigation you have to delegate and trust your officers, to your DIs and DSs and detectives to take on and deal with you. It's really difficult to try to manage under a microscope every action you put out when it is really moving at really fast pace. I mean, I'm speaking to Keith, Dave Green, one or two others. Mr. Nicholson's arriving, Leslie's coming in, as well as some of the other actions you're looking to put out, as well as the officers who are within the Kirkcaldy office at that time. So the briefing I got from Colin was was as brief as probably I've noted down there. The areas that you've asked me about, he's not went into in respect to that. I wasn't actually aware until I heard Colette Bell's evidence, for example, that she had attended with her child and her mother. So I was unaware of that.
Is that the sort of thing you would have liked to have been made aware of?
Yeah, and I don't know if Collins believes that it's under control and he has a grip of it, and he doesn't need to inform me around that. And there is enough going on that I'm dealing with that he's quite happy to take that aspect away and manage it as such. So as I say, I can see maybe why he's done it, but it's something as SIO, when it's as critical as that I would want to be aware of.
If you had been made aware of the situation with Colette Bell, the baby and breastfeeding, and the fact that a death message had been passed to her, which we've heard was quite a shocking and upsetting moment for her, how would you have handled Colette Bell if you'd been aware of all of that?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a number of different options. I think it was probably right to bring her to the Kirkcaldy office. I wasn't aware, and it would probably have been beneficial for the mother can maybe have taken the child, but I appreciate she was breastfeeding, and that's obviously more difficult. So, to be honest with you, a mother and a child has no place in a police station as witnesses. So again, with hindsight, probably shouldn't have been done there. We could have done it at a more appropriate location. We've got a number of kind of family suites across the country now that we can victims of any kind of sexual abuse or historical crime, we can take them to us, which is a more convenient location.
Would you have had something available like
Yeah.
that in 2015?
Yeah. So, with hindsight, yeah, it's probably not the best place to take mother and child. And again, the aspect of noting a statement from her at the time when she is extremely distressed is something we wouldn't do these days. You know what I mean? It's something that would give her time to basically be consoled with her family and friends, and we'd make arrangements over the coming days to go and get a more thorough statement from her. The most important aspect of engaging with Colette would be to get that initial information, which doesn't need to be in a statement form at that particular stage. It's really just about, you've called the police, can you explain why you've called the police? And thereafter, we could have went subsequently and noted a statement from her.
So could that have been more of a conversation to get information you needed?
Yeah, and it normally is. No, I mean, the first run through of any statement is a conversation. You don't initially write the statement. As soon as the person sits down, you'll say to them, look, well, tell me exactly what happened. And they'll run through exactly what the statement eventually consists of as such. But that first full recall, as we put it during any interview, is just a verbal recall.
And so you when you said give her time, and then you talked about maybe in the next few days, I think you said.
Yeah.
So would you have gone back at a later stage, not even necessarily that day?
Yeah. It's no, I mean, it's she is a witness. I mean, she's a significant witness, but the information that we had verbally from her would have allowed us to, for example, identify Martin Dick's relevance, Mr. Zaid's relevance as well, because I mean, she gave us mobile numbers for both of them, for example. You know what I mean? So that we already had, but and again, it's easy to be critical of the officers now, looking back, and I think they've done it with the best intentions. I mean, they would have been informed by Colin to note a statement from her. And again, it seems really hard and cold in the cold light of day that's what we did do, and retrospectively we could probably have stood back from it and said, we'll come and see you in 2 days' time, or can you give us a phone when you're ready to speak to us. But they did do it with the best of intentions to do that, but I appreciate the sensitivity around that.
Are you aware of an SOP that requires a statement to be taken as soon as possible?
No.
We heard from Colette Bell that she also gave information to the officers about Caddy Johnson, who was the sister of Mr. Byam and was his next of kin.
Yes.
Were you aware of Caddy Johnson as being the next of kin?
I was, yes. Just after the briefing from Colin Robson, I was aware of that, yeah.
So was that information given to you by Colin Robson or at a later stage?
It wasn't at that time, but it was later that I was made aware that we believed that the next of kin was Caddy Johnson.
And do we see that on your day book there?
I see just at the bottom of that page, I know it's Caddy's name's not mentioned, but there is aspect of flow, next of kin, and equality diversity considerations just at the bottom of that page.
Right. And that was that related to the next of kin?
Yes.
Does it mention Caddy Johnson?
It doesn't, no.
Anywhere there. It may be that there's an entry in your policy file.
I think there is, yeah, in my policy file.
Do you want to have a look at your policy file? Now, I think at some point you do mention at page 61462, which is decision 13. There may be a reference there to Caddy Johnson at that stage. I mean, this may have been a later entry, but...
sorry, is that decision 14?
13, I
13
think it will be 614. It's the right page on the screen.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And the named Caddy Johnson is there.
Yes.
It says next of kin's sister. So
Yeah.
at least by this stage in the file, I don't think there's a time given there. There is a time at the bottom, but you've already told us that this is prepared retrospectively.
Correct. Yeah.
And I think your inquiry statement says the timings on the pages aren't necessarily the time of the event. Rather, they are the time you completed this entry, or a recollection.
Yes, a recollection. Yeah.
Were you aware when Colette Bell was in the police station that she'd also mentioned that Mr. Bio had a child to another lady, Connie Barczyk?
No, I wasn't.
No. And we've heard evidence from Colette Bell that he had plans to meet Connie that day,
Right.
and to have contact with his child. And were you aware that Connie existed?
No, I wasn't. That
If-
information didn't come to me, no.
Had you been aware at that time that Mr. Bio had plans that day, and Colette Bell was concerned she didn't want Miss Barczyk to be standing waiting with her child for the handover, what would you have done if you'd known?
I mean, the priority was informing the next of kin, Caddy, of the death of Mr. Bio. Thereafter, I mean, in general, the conversation would be for, would Caddy mind if whether or not we basically made contact with his ex-partner to basically inform her around this matter. So I wouldn't automatically have went directly to Connie at that stage. The priority was more about the next of kin and the family being informed of the death.
Right. And so if you'd been aware of the existence of Caddy Johnson as next of kin when Colette Bell was still in the station, what actions would you have instructed if you'd been aware of that?
Sort of been aware of.
Caddy Johnson as next of kin. We heard evidence from Colette Bell
Yeah.
that she passed that information
yeah,
to
yeah,
the
yeah.
police officers.
Mhm.
You've said that you weren't aware of that when you took your notes in your day book.
No.
If you'd been aware in the morning when Colette Bell was in the police office, what steps would you have taken in relation to Caddy Johnson?
So we were looking to deploy, as one of the early priorities was the identification of family liaison officers to deploy to the family, and this came at an early discussion between myself and Keith Harrower when we spoke about the early priorities. One of them was the identification of family liaison officers, and there was discussion with Keith at that time, and Keith had indicated that he'd rather have trained family liaison officers from Police Scotland deployed to the family at the initial stages. And thereafter, what that did bring was some complications about identifying suitable family liaison officers that were on duty within Police Scotland at that particular time.
What were the difficulties?
So there was a number of challenges. We didn't have anyone on within the divisional area that was trained, and there was no one on within the surrounding divisions that we could find. I think the nearest one was Dundee or Perth, Aberdeen, I think we had identified. And what we had also, which further complicated matters, was when I'd actually Colin Robson, and I spoke to Stuart Houston about this as well, about identifying suitably trained family liaison officers, and I think I spoke to Keith Hardy also about it. The Storm /Scope system, so our personnel system, which identifies who's on for a particular skill. So you can, there's a drop-down menu you can put on, a drop-down menu you can look at, put in family liaison officer and who's on duty at that particular time or who's available. The initial aspects of that were inaccurate. And I was getting feedback from Colin Robson that the person that we thought was on duty was not on duty. So there was a delay with that as well. The two that we had identified who were from northern divisions were going to take a significant amount of time to basically come down from where they were. And there was discussions, as I said, between myself and Keith Hardy at the time round about was there any suitable MIT resources on that were family liaison trained around it. So we had identified, there was no one on from the MIT who were family liaison trained, as I can recall, but we had trained family liaison officers from, I think they were based out in Edinburgh, that were off duty, one being Kevin Hullison, and I believe from consultation, I think it was Keith Hardy contacted them, or Colin Robson, I think it was Keith, because I think he was with part of the MIT structure at that time, and we basically asked or recalled Kevin Hullison back to duty, and we identified, I think, a further female within one of the other divisions who was off duty, and again asked her to recall to duty at that particular stage, and asked both of them to make their way to Kirkcaldy Police Office for a briefing.
I'll come back to that if I may. I'm not conscious of the time for the.
We'll take a 15-minute break. Yes, Miss
Thank you.
Graham.
We were talking just before the break about the FLOs and appointment of the FLOs to family members. You gave me a number of issues that had caused difficulty that day, if I can describe it as that.
Yes.
Can we go through those individually just to get more information about this? The first was you described them as there as being an inaccuracy in the information that you were able to obtain from a drop-down menu. Was this on a computer system?
Yeah, so this came from Colin Robson, that he was trying to identify suitable flow resources. And we have a system called Scope, which is our personnel system that all police officers have access to. But within that, they have a search facility that you can search for specialisms. So crime scene manager, CBRN, interview advisor, various things that you can put.
Family liaison
Family
officer?
liaison, yeah. So again, you can put that in and you can look at who's on at that particular time when you're actually doing the search for it, who's on duty. And information coming back to me subsequent to that was that it would appear there was inaccuracies on that system, that the person that appeared to be on duty when Colin or one of his staff had contacted them to see for them to come out, they were made aware that they were off duty. So again, that was the initial delay with it, which took us a bit of time to work out exactly who was on duty that was flow trained as such.
Who was on duty that was flow trained?
So Kevin Hoolison, sorry, we couldn't find anyone who was, sorry, the two, I think I mentioned that I think there was one in Dundee and one in Perth. And I think there was one other up, I think in Aberdeen area that we could find that were on duty. But it was going to take a bit of time for them to actually come through to obviously Kirkcaldy to manage this.
When you allocate or obtain the services of a flow trained officer, are they based in the area that you're working in, or
No,
do they come from anywhere in Scotland?
It's a national specialism, so they can come from anywhere.
So is it always the case that when you're trying to find a flow, that they could be coming from different parts of Scotland?
Yeah.
And on this occasion, you talked about the distance between Northern Division. Is that because the officer who was flow trained was?
Yeah, no, I think, as I said, this was coming to me from Colin. I think the officer, there was one in Dundee and there was one, I may be wrong, I thought it was Aberdeen, I thought it was the A Division, I think it was given to me, and it was going to take a bit of time for them to actually attend, to take on the role of flow, which was going to cause some further unnecessary delay.
Was that because of the travelling distance
Yes.
between Dundee or Aberdeen, wherever they were? Right. Were they actually on duty there, though?
The information I got was that they were on duty, yeah.
So, did you look elsewhere for someone who was closer?
Yeah, so I'd spoke to Keith Hardy around this, just to, was there anyone within the MIT structure, the major investigation teams that were on duty at that time that were flow trained? And I don't think there were at that time across the country on a Sunday morning that were within the MIT cadre that were on that were flow trained. And again, subsequent to that, we identified, and I believe both of them were off duty, one of them being Kevin Hoolison. And I can't recall the second officer's name, but we thereafter made arrangements for them to be recalled to duty, to come back on, to basically attend at Kirkcaldy for a briefing around that.
And where was Kevin Hoolison?
So he was at home.
And how far away was he from Kirkcaldy?
I think he was within the Lothians and Borders area. I'm not sure exactly where his home address is, but I think he lives in that area.
A relatively short geographical distance. And you mentioned earlier another officer, a female officer, you can't remember her name.
I think she was in the same general area. But again, I was just getting this from Keith and from Colin.
And who did you contact or speak to have them recalled to duty and to travel to Kirkcaldy?
So that was, as I spoke to Leslie Bowell about this as well because of the delay. So we had, I think it was Keith Hardy arranged for for both of them to basically be called to duty and attend.
Were they MIT?
I have a feeling they were, yeah. I think Kevin was with the major investigation team at the time.
When did they arrive at Kirkcaldy?
So they arrived, I think, about 2 o'clock.
And is that something we can see in your day book?
I'm not sure if it is, to be honest with you, I need to check.
Please feel free.
So I think it's down at the page, the 1140 hours goal group.
Right, let's go to page, I think page 4 was the first sort of main, and then 5
Yeah,
we were looking at just before the break.
So number 7 there.
On the right-hand
Yeah,
side.
flow, 2-time DI MITs called out, and DC from Tayside MIT. So I think it was that aspect that I had updated the goal group that we were having problems, and we'd spoke to one of the DIs in the MIT. I know I spoke to Keith Hardy around it, but I don't know if Colin had maybe spoke to one of the DIs in the MIT as well, the detective inspectors, and we were trying to resource that whole functional area, which was really challenging on a Sunday morning.
And do we see in your day book anywhere the time that they arrived?
No, however, as I say, that was an update at the goal group at 11:40, which ran through till certainly over an hour, so it would have been around about 1 o'clock or thereabouts. But I have a feeling that they had not arrived because I know I had spoke to Leslie Bowl around about 2 o'clock around the fact that the delay was now becoming significant, and we thereafter basically just we came to the agreement we would simply deploy officers within the divisional area who were attached to the investigation at this time because we couldn't delay the delivery of the death message any further.
Explain, in a perfect world, how long would you like there to be between identifying the death of someone and you'd already passed a death message to Colette Bell?
No, I mean, it's such a significant action and it's such a high priority action. Even back then, no, I mean, it's 2015, it's crucial that you get that information to the family as soon as possible. And in general, the system works very, very well. We do get that message out very quickly to the family. It's one of the significant regrets I have about being an SIO on that particular day, about the delay with the message going to the family. And it was, there is absolutely no doubt, in a perfect world, we would have liked that message, and I would have certainly wanted that message to be delivered as soon as possible, certainly within an hour and a half. Of the problem usually is about identifying the resources and getting them to come for a briefing to the office, which takes normally around about an hour and a half, 90 minutes. But certainly within a kind of 2-hour window, you would be looking for the deployment. Once you've got that general identification of who you believe it is, to go out. So I would have expected by 1 o'clock in normal investigations we would have had that message delivered.
So from we've obviously heard about Colette Bell getting the death message at a stage where, although there hadn't been a formal identification, there was a view taken that it was likely to be her partner.
Yes.
And would it be, you've talked about 1 to 1.5 hours or a 2-hour window, would that be from that point, essentially, the moment you're giving the death message to Colette Bell?
The moment we've got, almost a 95%, 99% identification of who it is, from that time, which I believe was about 10:45 hours that day. So certainly within the space of 90 minutes that I would have expected. And in general, it does happen as quick as that. And again, it's with the regret, just due to the circumstances, the inaccuracies of the system, the aspect of travel for some of the identified family liaison officers, and thereafter having to recall family liaison officers onto duty again, that we, through agreement between myself and Leslie Bowl, and that we decided that we would simply deploy 2 officers, and it was the 2 officers that delivered the death message to Colette. We directed them to speak to the family and inform them of the death of Mr. Bio.
Could I just clarify a matter, please, Detective Chief Superintendent? You said earlier that you weren't aware of the death message being passed to Colette Bell at the time. Mm-hmm. Did you become aware
Yes.
of that at some point in the day, and if so, when was that?
It was right about, certainly before the first goal group, so it was between 10:45 and 11:30 hours. Before I went into the goal group, I was aware of the death message having been passed.
And did you know what the terms of that death
I
message
didn't know,
were?
sir, I didn't.
And how long were you involved in trying to locate a suitably trained flow?
So I wasn't personally involved in it. As I say, I had spoke to Colin and Stuart Houston, I think, had been involved in it as as Keith Hardy, around identifying anyone who was on duty that could attend quickly to basically take that on. So I had directed the actions around the 3 individuals to identify a suitable resource to come to Kirkcaldy for a briefing prior to being deployed to the family.
What was it that prompted you to call Leslie Bowl to discuss the issues with the flow?
So Leslie was within Kirkcaldy at that time.
Right,
She was there for the first call group
right.
at 11:30.
So when was it you actually raised the issue with Leslie Bowl about
So-
the flow?
So it was right about. So again, I spoke to Leslie when she arrived at Kirkcaldy office, which was round about, I think, about 10:30 or thereabouts. She was coming through for a goal group with ACC Nicholson. So I'd spoke to Leslie around about some of the priority actions that were ongoing, and we spoke about the flow, and I was saying that we were trying to identify suitable resources. I think we had identified, as I say, one in Dundee, I think it was, that they were having to travel a distance. So she knew at that time that there was potential issues with the identification of a suitable resource. And again, thereafter, around about, I think it was about 5 to 2 or thereabouts, I'd spoke to Leslie around about my concern around about the fact that this was causing a significant delay. We knew that Kevin Hullison and one other were coming out at that time, but they hadn't still arrived. So again, because of now 3 hours after the death message had been delivered to Colette, we couldn't wait any longer on that. And as I say, it's with regret that it did take so long.
And after Hullison and the other officer arrived, were they briefed at some stage as flows?
Yeah, so I don't know if you're going to get into this later on, but this is round about the aspect of what we had at that time was Kevin Hullison and one other arriving around about 2:30. The decision was made prior to their arrival to deploy Parker and Mitchell to deliver the death message to the family around about 2:30. As far as I can recall, or 2:35. And they did attend and deliver a death message to Caddy Johnson at that time. Kevin Hullison had arrived at that stage. However, what we were getting and what came back from the feedback from Parker and Mitchell, who had attended, who had contacted subsequently Dursley and thereafter Robson, that the information we had passed, that there was friction between Police Scotland and Caddy Johnson and the family because of the information that had been passed, and they were looking for some further information regarding the how Mr. Bayou had ended up deceased.
Can I take you through that
Yeah.
period of time a little bit more slowly? You had been advised that Kevin Hullison and another officer were being recalled to duty,
Yes.
and they were going to make their way to Kirkcaldy.
Yeah.
They were both trained flows.
Yeah.
And they arrived, I think you said earlier, about 1400. You're now saying maybe nearer 1430.
was between 2 and 2:30, as far as I can recall.
Is there anything in your daybook or your policy file that would assist us in identifying the time that they arrived?
No, I don't think there is, but I can recollect they were there at the time that the feedback came from Mitchell and Parker back into myself round about the first death message being delivered. So they were there at that time, and that was round about 3 o'clock.
Right.
So they were definitely there at that time.
Can you help us understand why there's already been a delay? You've explained your concerns
Yeah.
about that delay. But you know that trained flows are on their way to Kirkcaldy. They're coming from the Lothian and Borders area.
Yeah.
Why did you decide not to wait for the trained flows to arrive?
Because there was that time delay again on them attending, and thereafter being subsequently briefed around what we had and what we were dealing with. And as I say, the decision with myself and Leslie Bow was we would simply deploy officers to deliver the initial death message, and thereafter we would deploy flows as soon as they arrived with a more thorough explanation around what had occurred to the family and again to engage with the family at that time. So it was mainly due to the fact that both of us agreed that we couldn't delay any further. We knew they were on their way, but again, it was going to take a bit of time for them to get there and also to be briefed around what had occurred.
What checks did you have carried out in relation to how long it was going to take them to arrive at Kirkcaldy?
Well, I think I recall being told they were there within the hour because they were coming on. They were off duty. They were having to come back onto duty. So the information pass was run about within the hour.
And when did you receive that information?
When I was informed that they'd identified Hulison and one other to come out.
When was that?
It was round about, I think it was about 1:45 or 2, between 1:45 and 2 o'clock.
Right. And why did you decide it was a better option not to wait for that hour and to send 2 untrained DCs?
It was just the delay. It was going to delay another hour and a half. So by that time, there was significant information within the community that we were picking up. There was information within the media that we were picking up as well at that time. As I say, it was a decision we made to deploy untrained flows to, or untrained, not trained in flows to the family to deliver that initial death message.
Looking back at events now, you're aware of the situation and the difficulties that arose. Reflecting on that decision now, do you think you should have waited until you had trained flows in place?
I genuinely don't think it would have made any difference. I think the issue with hindsight is that it would have been probably far more beneficial to deploy PERK flows who were independent to the incident into the family unit, other than deploying Police Scotland flows when we have Police Scotland's officers involved in the restraint. So that's my reflection on it. I think, and I know that there was real issues around about PERK flow resources being identified on that Sunday. I did speak to Keith around that on a number of occasions, and I think Leslie had spoke as well at the Gold Group that was there an opportunity for PERK flows to deployed, but again there was no opportunity around about PERK flows being deployed on the Sunday we were informed. So with hindsight, would it have been more beneficial for Police Scotland flows to be deployed? Yeah, probably. Would it have made much difference to the potential issues and friction that came between the family unit and Police Scotland officers at that time? I don't think it would. I think it would have been probably more beneficial with hindsight that we deployed PERK flows who could have given a more independent, transparent overview of their role, which is independent from Police Scotland, and that may have assisted the family to perhaps understand that there was now an independent body now coming in to investigate exactly what had occurred.
First of all, is there anything else that you could have done to speed up the arrival of Hulison and the other officer who was afloat?
I don't think so. I mean, other than we identified them at an early stage that we would have to go into recall individuals from being off duty. I think the surprise was for a national force at that particular time to have no flows on duty within that particular central belt area was something that we were was pretty significant, and the nearest flows that we could get were on duty were in some of the northern divisions. So again, that was one of the challenges we faced. As I say, no, I mean it's something that I mean I significantly, I take learning from it now about the aspect of, I mean, early deployment of train flows to the family unit. But at that time, because of the circumstances of the incident, it may have been beneficial that the deployment of flows came from PERK and not from Police Scotland.
When you use the phrase pretty significant in terms of, was it PERK you were referring to? PERK didn't have trained flows, was pretty significant,
no,
or Police Scotland trained flows?
Yeah, Police Scotland trained flows, to be honest. I mean, it's for an organisation the size of what we are or were, to have no on-duty capability at that time was surprising to me, and the fact that we had to look at some of the northern divisions to look at resourcing a critical incident was, again, pretty significant that we had to look as far afield as that. And also, as I say, the challenge with PERK not having the capacity to call out flows from their cadre was an additional challenge.
Whether we're thinking about PERK flows or Police Scotland flows, what skills do flows have to help that liaison or interaction or engagement with families?
Yeah, they do. I mean, they went on a training course about that interaction and about the role of the PERK, as well as being, the role of the flows, as well as being that direct link into the family of a deceased person. They're also part of that whole investigative structure as well, so it's a joint role in respect of that. So, and again, a lot of although they are trained, a lot of it comes with their deployment and their experience, and the real benefit of having an experienced family liaison officer involved in any significant investigation. The benefits they bring is really significant in my experience. So,
can you give us some further explanation of that?
No, I think it's just that, as well as answering the questions from the family, I mean, if I'm talking about homicides in general, or even child deaths, as well as answering some difficult questions from the family, they can also assist the investigation with some of the antecedents around what's occurred and what the family unit are asking around, and again, potentially point the investigation in a particular manner. So the role is, as I say, it's almost a dual role of being part of the investigation team, but also being that direct link into the family unit.
I was going to ask you about that, because we have heard some evidence about their benefits in relation to the family welfare.
Yep.
But we've also heard some evidence that they remain part of the investigation team. Is that your experience?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's crucial that they have that dual role. They're not there simply to support the welfare and the well-being of the family, although that is a crucial role. They are deployed, they are detectives, so that's the reason they're trained and deployed into that particular family at that time, is to, as I say, look at particularly antecedents around about the family, what's occurred, why has it came to this, what's the feeling around it, is there any request that they're looking for, and again, as well as access to the deceased, I mean, from the flow side, and that they can do a lot of access transition round about that. They also, my experience, provide a real crucial role to myself as an SIO round about what they can bring to the investigation, round about what the family are feeling or thinking, or have concerns around as such, and thereafter you can put in place a strategy to manage that as such. So it's a crucial role.
And does that dual role exist, whether they're Police Scotland flows or PERK flows?
Yeah, no, I mean, I can't comment. I'm not sure of what training the PERK flows get, but I would imagine it is in line with Police Scotland.
Right. Can I ask you about the strategy that you had in place in relation to Colette Bell's house, Arran Crescent?
Yeah.
You've talked to us about when you became aware that she was in the police office. In your inquiry statement, and please feel free to look at it, at 391, you say that the house was seized on your instruction. We can maybe go to 391 and we'll... sorry. And you were asked about Colette Bell's address here, and you say the house was seized on my instruction. This was after the call at 8:30 and her concern for her partner Shekubayo that she'd found him to be missing, and also from the briefing regarding the lead up to the altercation in this incident.
Yeah.
Can you explain to me, given what you'd said earlier about not really even knowing she was in Kirkcaldy initially, in what way was the house seized on your instruction?
So it was originally seized on the direction of Colin Robson, but I endorsed that aspect of it. As you quite rightly put, that attendance at Colette's address was done without my knowledge or my direction, but when Colin explained to me around it, I totally agreed with it and endorsed that aspect of it.
And when you say endorsed, what does that mean?
So as SIO, I supported Colin's decision to basically secure that property.
And as part of that endorsement, did you ask any questions about the authority on which it had been seized?
No, I didn't at that particular time, but with the relevance to the investigation into an unexplained death, I could see the whole aspect why we would seize it at that stage. We hadn't searched it at that point, but the aspect of seizing all the relevant locations, as I said, I couldn't see any issue with that at all.
And not having any issue with it, what was your view about the legal authority for seizing Colette Bell's house?
So that would be under common law power, not mean to seize a property and linked to an unexplained death. We were unsure exactly what we had at that point. It was relevant because of the call that Colette Bell had made round about the disturbance within it. Quite rightly so, the officers that attended went into the house and searched for any other person within or any other person that may have been injured, and thereafter obviously came back out. And again, as I say, the amount of incidents I've dealt with such as this isn't common practice for what we do.
And we've heard some evidence about the nature of consent.
Yeah.
And we've heard evidence from Mitchell and Parker about their views on that. Did you ask whether Colette Bell's consent had been obtained? Or?
No, I didn't get into the details of that, but this is quite a common occurrence whereby through the course of any investigation there is a need to prevent the loss of any evidence. So we would seize initially a property and thereafter, depending on the aspect of the requirement to search, we would either go through consent with the householder or we would look at warrantry around it. Now, there's been a number of occasions I've been involved in whereby we would seize the property of a witness, and they would thereafter refuse or not give consent to search. Now, we would simply go back to the Procurator Fiscal and explain the circumstances of what we had, and we would be issued with a warrant, and the great number of times around that, and so we would thereafter basically search the property in respect of a warrant. So, as I say, the properties were all relevant and all linked to the movements of Mr. Bio prior to him becoming in contact with the police in Hayfield Road.
So in relation to Colette Bell's
Yes.
address, in terms of searching the property,
Yes.
was that done on your instruction?
No, it wasn't. So that was action which I had given to Stuart Houston as the crime scene or the scene coordinator
Right.
to manage that. So Stuart, and to take the whole aspect of the 5 loci away from me, although I obviously chaired the forensic strategy meeting, signed off the forensic strategy document, the aspect of the search and the resources utilised for that all sat with Stuart Houston.
So let's look at that forensic strategy document. And this was PS 01298. And if we can look at page 4 of 7, so PS 01298 and page 4 of 7. And do we see at the top of that page there's mention of Locus 3 and that's Colette Bell's property? And this document, the forensic strategy document, says in this initial phase this locus will remain under protection with a scene entry log in place.
Yeah.
And there's no mention there of searching.
No, it's a high level document, the strategy document. It wouldn't get into as much detail as that around it. It's really around the discussion where the priority loci are at that time.
And where would the discussion take place in relation to searching the properties?
So that would have took place with Stuart Houston briefing the crime scene manager around what was required at that location.
When would that take place?
That would have took place prior to the search of the property.
So where can we find that in your day book?
So that's in the forensic strategy document.
So it wouldn't go back into your day book then?
I'm not sure, I don't think it did, but
Do you want to look at the day book and
Yeah.
see if there is anything?
I think it's the whole aspect of the delegation by myself to Stuart Houston of the various scenes is what I'm trying to put forward. So the goal group at 11:40 hours in my day book.
Right, is this page 5, I think?
Yeah, so you'll see that the brief that I given around that is around the various relevant
This is
loci.
the right-hand side,
Yeah.
5 loci,
Yeah.
and one of them mentioned is Arran Crescent, and it
Yes.
has the name Colette Bell next
Home
to
address
it.
of Colette Bell, yeah.
Right, and does this mention search, sorry?
No, to be honest, it probably wouldn't. That is a discussion I had with Stuart when we were looking at the forensic strategy document. The information we were getting was that there was no friction or there was no feedback that we were getting that there was going to be any issues with the search under consent. And again, if it did come to that, we would simply have reverted to warrants.
Right. And so, if we've heard from Colette Bell that she didn't consent to a search, what does that differ from your understanding of events that day?
Yeah, there was no information given back to me at all around about any of the locations that there had been a refusal for search in any of the locations.
We've heard some evidence from a DC who's spoken to the inquiry about how you can go about obtaining consent
Yes.
from a homeowner, and that can be part of a discussion with the homeowner where it's explained to them what the nature of the consent is, that they can voluntarily agree to have the house searched or seized, that they can withdraw that consent at any time, and that a record of that can be kept in a notebook, and it can be signed, and that would be good practice.
Yes.
And we've heard other evidence to suggest that is good practice. If you're seeking to search a house on the basis of consent. What was your understanding of the approach that would be taken by officers at these loci?
So what you describe is best practice today.
Mm-hmm.
What we had 8 years ago, it wasn't as well known that that's what we would do. At locations just now, as soon as we get near and we get consent to search, we will either note it in a notebook or we will note it on their statement, and we will explain to them about the refusal, but it wasn't as commonplace in 2015.
And what was the normal practice in 2015?
The normal practice would be simply to ask if there was any issues, and if they reverted to any issues being apparent around the refusal, we would simply have went for to search a property, for a warrant to search a property. And as I say, I can think of a number of examples in dealing with homicides in the west of Scotland, whereby there has been the refusal of particular individuals to allow us to search, and we have simply went for warrants at that particular time.
But you would, even in 2015, you would expect an officer to ask the homeowner if they consented?
If they had any issues with it, yeah. I mean, that would be a normal discussion around the fact, look, you're a witness to this incident, it's only because of the fact that, because of the movements of Mr. Bio, that we are looking at this location just now. Our intention is to seize it at this time to see the relevance of it, and so I would expect the officers to speak to the householders in respect of that matter and say, look, if there is any issues with that. And again, if the householders or the individuals concerned with these properties had any particular issue, they could make us aware of it. And as I say, we would have explained to them, okay, we still basically need to search the property just now, and if you don't consent to it, we'll simply look at speaking to the Procurator Fiscal about a warrant.
Did you personally carry out any checks to ensure that the correct legal authority was in place, whether consent or a warrant, in relation to Colette Bell's house?
No, and I think it's difficult to explain round about my role in respect to that. It's a strategic role whereby you're delegating various responsibilities to individuals you can trust around particular aspects. So as I say, Stuart Houston, who I knew Stuart for a number of inquiries that we've been involved in together, I knew that what he would put in place would be sufficient to basically account for the search by consent, and if there were any issues he would have made me aware of them as such. So I wasn't particularly aware, and drilling down into, can I just check with you if Colette Bell's house, has she consented, has she given us written consent? So no, I wasn't involved in all that, to be honest with you. It was delegated down from my role.
Okay. So your position is that Stuart Houston would have been looking into those level issues?
So he would have had deployed crime scene managers to all the different locations who would have engaged with the householders around what we were planning to do about the return of the property, how long it was likely to take, and so on. That's, as I say, a normal course of events.
And that he would have been more interested in the details of the authority and whether it had been obtained.
And if there was any feedback coming that there was any issues with any of the consent that was given or implied.
We've talked earlier today about Colin Robson
Yes.
continuing and the issue about whether he was SIO or not.
Mm-hmm.
Would you have expected Colin Robson to have been involved in some of those issues, given he'd been involved from the morning?
I mean, I think Stuart was overseeing it, but I think Colin was obviously involved in a number of locations because of his involvement in the morning. But as I say, with Colin's experience, Stuart with his experience, the whole aspect of the search of the properties was delegated down to what I believe was a competent team to deal with that.
Do you know when Colette Bell's house was searched?
No, not exactly, but I think Colette Bell's was the one house or one property we kept overnight, I seem to recollect.
We might talk about that.
I might need to check that, but there were. I mean, some of the locations were very, very quickly resolved because there was very little we had to do at them. And I need to check my policy file, my daybook around that, but I think there was one property that we basically we held overnight, and I think it was Colette's house because of the signs of the disturbance within. So again, that was, I believe that I made the decision around about holding on to that until after the post-mortem examination, in case we require further analysis of that property.
Right.
But again, I probably need to check my policy file around that.
Okay. I'd like to move on to another property, Martin Dick. You've mentioned Martin Dick a few times. We've heard evidence from Martin Dick. He had a partner at the time, Kirsty MacLeod. She's now his wife. And I think you've made mention of Martin Dick in your daybook. So can we look at any entries, first of all, where you mention Martin Dick? And I'd like you to explain to the Chair what you knew about Martin Dick. I think on the previous page, the one we see on the screen, there was his name mentioned. At the top of the right-hand side.
Yeah, so that's the previous page is the priorities, so that's 12, I think. Mark Dixon, NFD, I'm not sure the relevance of that, but Martin Dick is obviously detailed below that.
Mm-hmm. So it's no longer on the screen, we would have to see slightly higher. So that's it. So right-hand side, against the Roman numeral 12, and you can see the name Martin Dick.
Yeah.
And what are the letters next to his name? It looks like A3, but... I
don't know if it's A3 or 43, I'm not sure what exactly that is.
Right.
But I think what you've got there, and the other side of that, there's potential third loci. So again, this is early stages of this. We're just kind of unpicking exactly what's occurred. So that's the first notation of Martin Dick in my daybook as such.
Tell us what you knew about the connection between the events in Hayfield Road and Martin Dick.
So Martin Dick and Kirsty were associates of Mr. Bayou, and when we began to look at the timeline of the deceased's movements from the evening of the 2nd of May into the 3rd, his engagement initially with Said at the home address, and thereafter their attendance at Martin Dick's house to watch the boxing which was on in the early hours of the morning. When we began to note statements, there was information coming from Zaid in particular that Zaid and the deceased had went to Martin Dick's house to watch the boxing. This was a pre-arranged event that they were going to watch the boxing. They were friends. And on arrival at Martin Dick's house, they basically stayed to watch the boxing. But I think when we began to look at what Zaid was saying, and also from Martin Dick and Kirsty, was that it would appear that at that stage, 0500 hours in the morning or thereabouts, that the deceased was acting out of character, and there was indications from Zaid's statement that he was mentioning that someone had disrespected him. So again, the relevance was, and we know, sorry, just to continue and to conclude that side of it, we know from Zaid's statement that the deceased thereafter left, and Zaid left a short time later, and that was the last time Martin Dick's house was relevant.
And so in terms of the connection, there was no suggestion or information available to you at that time that Martin Dick or Kirsty MacLeod, for that matter, had been anywhere near Hayfield Road.
No.
It wasn't in connection with those events. And no information available to you to suggest they had had some connection with his death in Hayfield Road?
Yeah, there was no information, but there was a lot we didn't know at that stage. So it's about keeping that open mind round about, is this relevant or not? The difficulty is if we do not take a particular action at that stage and secure particular property, and it thereafter becomes relevant, there's a potential we may lose any evidential aspect to that because we've not carried out that action. So I think it's quite easy to say that the fact there was no relevance, but we didn't know at that time how relevant it was.
So this was part of going to the house of Martin Dick, was part of keeping an open mind about all the possibilities, all the hypotheses which you had at the back of your mind at
Yes.
that time. Thank you. And I will be going into this in more detail.
Yeah.
I wonder if that might...
Is that a convenient point to stop? Very well, we'll stop there and we'll continue with your evidence at 10 o'clock tomorrow
Okay,
morning.
thanks, sir.